Thank you so much, Connor. And again, thank you to all of you for being here today. To all of the organizers, which has been primarily Camilo and Connor. So let's please just start with them, with giving them a round of applause, because they have been working so hard. Don't cry, Connor, don't cry. And to Camilo, because Camilo went through, went beyond the... and of course, thank you again to UTEP and to Chief Manjarres for hosting us. When I was listening to Ilka, where's Ilka? She's like, oh, there you are. Ilka's presentation. I kept thinking a lot about, again, the significance of us hosting of the team hosting the event here. When I first started to be in contact with the guys with the team, I remember that Ernesto said one day, he's like, I hate this research that we do. Mm-hmm. I wish, there was, someday that we could just do volcanoes. I think that's what you said, We could just go and turn and do research on volcanoes, because I think it's so painful. And another thing that you said in Mexico is like you throw a rock and you hit somebody who has been affected or afflicted by this level of violence. I have myself been dealing with an event like this for the last few weeks, and I cannot tell you how I can't even describe how this has, the kind of impact that this has had on my family. But I was also thinking, as we were having, the questions and the conversations, I was also thinking of the role of the so-called perpetrators, the people that we're talking about, the young people who are actually behind many of these acts, and the fact that they are so the very language that we use is very state-driven, and the way we criminalize them and the way we talk about them as, members of the so-called cartels, members of organized crime, despite the fact that the very term organized crime is so problematic, at many levels. And I wanted to start, also drawing from your presentation and a quote last year, and I think several of you, the people here in the room, are aware of our work with smuggling facilitators on the Mexican side of the border. So last year, we had a summer camp of research methods where we were actually able to recruit children who had been involved in border crossing facilitation. And this was one of their testimonies. And I wanted to share it because it shows that, again, not the fact that you are involved in a criminal activity does not mean that you're exempt from experiencing violence yourself. So this is a testimony from one of the young women who were part of the research methods summer camp, and and she was reflecting about her own experience. And also, what I love about this, and the reason I wanted to share it, is how she herself is trying to change the conversation. We keep talking about Juarez and the border as this land zone or this minefield, or and we keep talking about the border in general as if it was this monolithic space that is charged with death and murder and blood. When there's people who are alive, people who have survived, in communities that continue to strive, if you either to not only to struggle but also to succeed. If you have a chance to go to Juarez during those days, the days that you are here, please go. Please experience Juarez. Please experience the border. Talk with the people, because many times I think that the rhetoric of the border has only been about El Paso. And not about Juarez, and not about the people, and the Mexican side of the border, who have also been very much involved and affected by the sense by all of the dynamics that we're experiencing, again, on both sides. I was also thinking, given the fact that we are here at UTEP, I was faculty here for a couple of years, and many times I had to remind my students, you are the border experts, not us. You cross the border every day. You are the ones who are spending all of this time crossing, having to perform, right, who you are, having to give explanations about who you are. We are not. So I think we are privileged in that sense that we are in this room being able to discuss experiences that are very common to the students at UTEP. One of them is also, another experience is the fact that for many of the people of the border, for many of the young people of the border, and those of you who are faculty here and who have seen it as well, becoming an immigration enforcement agent or being able to be a federal agency is a huge aspiration. And in the context of the border being one of the most impoverished regions along, within the United States, this is indeed a career that is very attractive. And that is many times, again, just overly simplified by the label of, oh, these are horrible people that need to be, also contained, when we are, again, talking about our students from UTEP. So I think there's a connection that can be made, in terms of how we talk about the border, how we talk about the people from the border, and also, and I am here, I'm not saying that we're talking about the same people, but we are talking about the people of the border when we talk about those who are engaged in some of these activities. One of the concerns that I've voiced through my work, through my work on smuggling facilitation is precisely the issue of representation. Those of us who have worked on border crossings or who are here, again, gathered today to talk about smuggling, trafficking, kidnappings, crimes of mobility in general, are very familiar with this kind of portrayal. The depictions of migrant smugglers as, this kind of half-hidden male, of dark skin, and primarily, again, on the context of the US-Mexico border, the narrative that we are dealing about transnational organized crime. This is part of coverage that Al Jazeera had a couple of years ago. For the cartel and the smuggler, there's an unmovable bottom line. Migrants are merchandise and to be profited for one way or the other. This has created, or allowed rather, for the perpetuation of narrative of, we're being taken over by smugglers. The smugglers have invaded the borders, and again, the fact that I am now at the UI has allowed me to see the global nature of this narrative. Smugglers are highly racialized and gendered as male. They are depicted as this primitive and pretty naturally, inherently savage creatures that tend to be, and here we see the racialization as Mexican, also animalized with terms as coyote or pollero, that tend to reflect, in a sense, the rhetoric, the very language that we use as Mexicans to refer to the facilitator, but also in the European context, there's this emphasis over marking them as African or Muslim. We also see this recurrent representations of smugglers as hypersexual predators that prey on women, that rape women, that follow a very clear smuggling business model that rely on technology, and that also facilitate, or that are organized rather, in this hierarchical and transnational organized crime groups that, as the work of Kate and Stephanie have shown, is subjected to some examination when we actually take a closer look at the empirical data. And in fact, perhaps I need to make another parenthesis here to talk about the fact that my presentation is also, I'll be glad to share with you my empirical research, the one that I have carried out with smuggling facilitators. But I think this is also an opportunity for us to reflect on some of the challenges that we face, because it's the rhetoric of border control, of immigration, of invasion, many times has taken us away from the very realization or the acceptance, rather, of being able to accept that we really lack empirical data. We are talking about, what's the word I'm looking for? We're talking about clandestine, illicit practices that are inherently difficult to research. Having access or getting access to some of the facilitators or some of the spaces that this research requires, is complicated, and not only puts the researcher at risk, but also the people who could participate in the research. That again, that for me became very clear being faculty here on the US-Mexico border, knowing and becoming increasingly aware that many of our students were actually involved in these activities, but were at the same time crossing the border to come to school. And how do we manage, methodologically, some of those issues? Along those lines, we have this very lack of critical research methodologies, approaches, and representations. As we see, we tend to have or tend to follow this very monolithic characterization of the smuggler. And something that we have seen consistently, and this is regardless of what location of the world you are in, the focus on representation. This very graphic, very dramatic images that are intended to generate or to compel the public, to react. Many times, again, not based on much of empirical backing, but on the shock factor. Along those same lines, we see that smuggling is predominantly characterized as a transnational crime. And this is not a transnational organized crime. And this should not come as a surprise. We have, in fact, a representative here from UNODC. Where is she? Is she here? Where's Marisol? Okay. Well, UNODC is the organization, rather than the group within the United Nations that was actually behind the development of the transnational protocol on organized crime and also on smuggling. But the very characterization, the very fact that the terminology that we use is so focused or emerged from law enforcement perspective, many times has the consequence of exempting the state from its role in migration control and border enforcement. We see how smugglers, tend to be labeled over and over as the ones who are perpetrating the kinds of offenses or the kinds of violence that we see, but there's not a lot of structural analysis behind it. What are the conditions that are creating or that are allowing for the smuggling facilitator to appear or to emerge? There's also, of course, the historical and sociocultural dimensions of mobility. The fact that many of us who have migrant backgrounds, who have migrant families, perhaps our own family members or ourselves at some point relied or dependent on the labor of a border crossing facilitator or a smuggling facilitator. And something that is very problematic and that we tend to do, many times even unintentionally, is this use interchangeably of different forms of crime, which is in reference to smuggling, which is trafficking. So we see the interchangeable use of trafficking and smuggling. What I've also seen is this counter attempt, right, to separate both, to separate them, to try to separate them as if they could exist independently from each other. And what we have seen consistently is that many times one person who enters a situation of smuggling, a migrant who willingly pays a fee, may him or herself find him or herself in a situation that is related to trafficking, which is not voluntary in nature. I know I'm rushing through all of this, but again, I'll be very glad to share more of the empirical work related to it. And here I think I'm going to move to something that was touched upon earlier during the first panel, this emphasis on networks and cartels, that many times also communicates this notion of very pyramidal or hierarchical organizations that in a sense, not in a sense, many ways, makes invisible this other forms of ordinary, everyday, opportunistic activities that we tend to see and document. Smaller groups that are really not connected or organized in any kind of network or cartel-like structure, but that are very much organic and connected to the community, that don't really, or they don't necessarily have to be connected to larger groups or larger structures outside of the community, and which on many occasions hides and makes invisible the roles of women, young people, feminized migrants, and also indigenous communities. Along the US-Mexico border, one of the populations that tends to be often incarcerated as a result of smuggling charges are indigenous communities in Arizona, for example. And the emphasis on cartels, the emphasis on transnational organized crime hides these dynamics, these specific patterns that we get to see on the border. The work that we have been carrying out initially here at UTIP and then at the Migration Policy Center at the UI aims to recraft or to rethink the way we think about smuggling. For that, we are, by bringing the experiences not only of women, but also by incorporating smuggling facilitators also into the research process, we have been able to adopt a more intersectionality-informed approach, relying also on feminist methodologies. I'm also a little sad that Nick Natividad isn't here yet, because he would, also echo some of the work that we have done on the need to recognize migration and its spaces, including the border, as a place that is very rich on knowledge. People migrate and people cross the border not only through the assistance of smuggling facilitators or cartels or networks. They do it many times facilitated by friends, family members, a high percentage of people who are actually, let me see if I have the numbers here, who are prosecuted for smuggling facilitation on the U.S.-Mexico border do it on their own behalf. And that is smuggling friends, family members, and in the case of women, their own children. This is data from the U.S. Sentencing Commission. They haven't had the report come out for last year. But what we have right now is that almost 2/3 of all the people, and these are only federal convictions. States convict at the state level, but within the United States, we have almost 2/3 of the people who are convicted are U.S. citizens of Latino origin. So again, if we bring not only the gender component, but here also the one that is related to gender, we see how smuggling facilitation and the prosecution of smuggling facilitation is a border crime. Most of the cases involve only five, in fact, U.S. court districts along the U.S.-Mexico border. And if you do a correlation of those 5 U.S. district courts, you would also, with income, you will see that they are the lowest per capita income communities in the United States, not only within the border, but within the United States. Am I out of time? Okay. And contrary to, again, to many of the larger observations that we tend to, or perceptions rather, that we have in connection with smuggling facilitation, this very same source of information reflects that about 50% of all cases that are prosecuted at the federal level within the United States that are related with smuggling are small-scale, independent efforts involving groups of 1 to 5 people. And 97% of those cases, have not involved any weapons or no physical injury. And the groups or the people who are facilitating them show no ties to organized crime. And by this, we're talking about these larger organizations that tend to be represented. Now, it's also very important to emphasize, here I am not saying, and I don't intend to communicate the notion that smuggling facilitators are great and that, we should all support them. But rather, the goal is to problematize the narrative that has been perpetuated along the U.S.-Mexico border concerning the people who are being prosecuted. When we take a closer look, once again, at who gets charged or who is prosecuted for smuggling within the United States, we tend to see, again, there is very specific profile of the people. They are usually friends and family members who hire smugglers, for their own, smuggling facilitators for their own mobility goals. Migrants themselves, who are trying to cover portions of their journeys by performing tasks along the way. Women of color, indigenous people in the community, and also elderly residents along the U.S.-Mexico border. And part of the project that I have been developing over the years, and children and young people who are also employed as facilitators, on both sides of the border. Because that is another aspect that many times we tend to think, well, smuggling is only happening on the Mexican side, and it stops on the border. It's not happening, once you cross. Most of the work that I have carried out is actually what happens after people cross the border. The very fact that the majority of the people who are prosecuted are of Latino or Mexican-American origin is already pointing at a specific form of practice.
But you would say that all these categories fulfill the function of smuggling?
These are not categories that are fulfilling smuggling. These are the people who are, and we can talk about the specific tasks that people perform. Something that the data continues to reflect is the fact that irregular migration facilitation processes are consistently forms of labor that are performed by the poor. Many times, something that we get to hear is like, well, smugglers make thousands of dollars every year, and they are earning and they make billions and trillions, and there's all of these numbers that are quoted. Most of the times, what we see is people, again, with very low income who reside along the U.S.-Mexico border. This is, again, just what some of the data has revealed. That the income that they provide does not that they generate does not really provide long-term social mobility for any of the participants. And when people tend to talk about the transformation of smuggling along the U.S.-Mexico border, or not only the transformation, but the evolution, because that's another word that we hear quite often. What this data also suggests, if you look at actually numbers from the 1990s, 1993, I think, to 2017, which was the last report from the U.S. Sentencing Commission, the number of women, the percentage of women who are involved in migrant smuggling has doubled. At least the numbers of women who have been prosecuted. So one other aspect, and this is kind of outside of the scope of the presentation, migration facilitation is many times seen as a form of care or protection, rather than the lens that many times we apply into it as a form of organized crime. And along those lines, that's, I think, one of the reasons why we have to be very careful on how we mobilize the trope of organized crime, because of how the kinds of populations or the groups that it tends to make invisible. And in that sense, trafficking or counter-smuggling solutions, rather, many times fail to identify this everyday nature of migration and this kind of strategies that emerge from the ground. And just, really just to conclude, the fact that smuggling is a form of human security from below, and that has been critical to the way we see and organize the work that we do. The migrants are people from the margins have historically developed their own forms of security, their own force of mobility against the structural efforts that are developed to exclude them or to curtail their mobility. And I'll stop. Thank you so much.
Hi, so I think we have about 20 minutes for questions, so if anybody wants, so Temi Tope first, and then turn it on.
I wonder what level of public support there is for migrant kidnappers amongst the people. And I ask because in the Lake Chad Basin, one of the key concerns of state forces is that the local populations are giving significant levels of support to the kidnappers of migrants in Chad, Niger Republic, and so forth. So public support, that's number one. And a related question is whether or not these kidnappers are considered common criminals or social bandits. And so, again, in the Lake Chad Basin region, specifically in Nigeria's Niger Delta region, which I will be speaking about tomorrow, some of these kidnappers actually provide certain social services. So they, in some cases, roads, and they provide scholarships and so on and so forth to members of the communities in which they operate, in which they kidnap people. So I was just wondering what the picture might be in the context that you have studied. Thank you.
Going to do some exercise this morning. So, please, thank you. Thank you. Thank you both for your excellent talks. I had a couple questions/comments for Caitlin. I think it's really interesting to compile this data because it is so sporadic, and it goes to what Gabriella said. There's not a whole lot, right? I think that, especially quantitatively, I think the thing that we did was probably the only thing. It was, not COLEF data though, but it's my data.
Sorry.
It's all right. But one of the things I think that I was wondering about, if you saw, was some kind of scaling down, right? So one of the things, especially in the Northeast, we see, and why we see a place like Reynosa have such an outweighted presence in the data, is that there is a lot to be said, not just about these, when we think of organized crime, we think of these monolithic organizations, but the street level people, right? The local power actors do have a different approach towards kidnapping as in different spots, right? And so a lot of kidnapping in Reynosa is in Rio Bravo there. And so when we saw something like last year where there was about 380 migrants that had been found kidnapped in Matamoros, the local word was that was dispute between different gangs, right? So not only this kind of between Gulf Cartel Zetas, or what's left of the Zetas, right? But local people from here and there picking up each other's kidnapped groups of migrants and reporting them, you know, playing with this patchwork of state/criminal organizations, right? So that's something that I wanted to know if you saw, but also to think about. As far as the Northwest, I don't know. I mean, I think that you're right about some places having much more smaller localized, but I don't think that they're entirely independent, right? I think the way that a lot of it works, and I've written about this with Howard Campbell, is that somebody's getting a cut and somebody's approving. They might not be monopolizing it in a certain way, but there is some tacit approval that goes up and down. So that might not show up in a police record. I would say particularly a place like Altar, you know, that's not going to have these things happening there. And the other thing I think about the Northwest, which is a big challenge, is there's a blank map problem here, right? Which is when we look at the Northwest, we see most of the kidnappings reported in Phoenix, right? Phoenix is the #1 place where people report being held against their will. And so that is tricky because it's the same people, it's the same kind of thing, but it's off on the other side of the map, and so it's going to be a totally different data and not kept in your way, as Gabriella points out. The charges are ridiculous, you know, and so the kind of government straw man is really hard to push against when you look at compiling that information. So I don't know if those are, you know, questions that you'd like to sort of respond to or think about, but that's kind of what we saw when we were doing the surveys of people about being kidnapped. Yeah.
Thank you. Also, this comment is for Caitlin, and thank you both of you for your presentations. There's a huge effort, we can see it there. Regarding the Northwest section, I will present later on today, specifically on Tijuana. And well, yes, there is, of course, smuggling actors, specifically in Tecate, but these are counting. And talking to Fernando Segueda, which you guys probably know because he's a huge actor in kidnapping and disappearances, he told me that in monthly basis, there'll be up to 15 kidnapping cases / disappearances / no? So yeah, some cases are smuggling, but most of the cases, at least in the case of Tijuana, are related to organized crime, specifically to the Sinaloa cartel, and talking about those small cells or these people that might not be interconnected. Well, yes, in Tijuana they're structured, and in the case of Sinaloa, they're called Los Rojos, no? They operate for them. So it's another income, additional income for them because it's easy money, no? And in the case of Jalisco / Arellano Felix cartel, they're also kidnapping. So I want to point that out because, yes, organized crime is related to kidnapping, at least in Tijuana, Tecate, and Mexicali. And the second thing, I really found very interesting your the average of the ransom. It's just letting you know, we talked with Luis, the director of the anti-kidnapping unit in Tijuana, and he told us that it's very difficult to gather this information because it obviously changes dramatically from each case, no? So he told us that it's between 2,000 pesos and $2,000 what they might ask for a ransom. Yet again, this is, I will present later on, but now the statistics as, remind me your name, please? Emiliano, as I mentioned, there is a 95% under register crime, no? So, cifra negra en español.
So if we take maybe there's a couple of questions here. I'm just conscious we have to wrap up on the 12th with an hour for lunch, getting to the union and back. So take 2 more questions, and then let the presenter go.
Thank you. No, thank you to Gabriella for the very interesting research. I have a question for Caitlin, though. No, I think, to me, I think it's really fascinating, but it kind of, I feel a bit resistant to the results because, and maybe you can explain some data or the whys, because maybe there is this underreporting precisely of those instances in which is organized crime and in which migrants do not come back. So we, the instances maybe are either not reported, are not covered by the media, are not known. So maybe speaking about that, and also considering, of course, the incidents in Nuevo León in as well in the same period. So I'm surprised that there was no available data about that maybe links it to migrants, and that's why you were not able to see it there. But then also the next question would be, if it's not for, I mean, if it's, then why are people kidnapping? I mean, were you able to establish and determine where the whys? Is it only about economic incentives? Because, I mean, I just would like to challenge that and to see what were you able to find in that regard.
Yeah, I have a quick one for Gabriela, and this is thinking about resistance, right? So you're saying that smuggling could be also seen as resistance from below, these kind of mobility experiences. Could you link that with kidnapping, or is smuggling the only way in which mobility is kind of working as resistance? And just going back to the issue of what is behind the kidnapping, economic kidnapping, I think there's a lot of data, just as a comment, on how kidnapping is also used to punish people. So it's not about getting the money from that, but also derecho de piso. You don't pay that, then you get kidnapped. And then we had a couple of interviews last week with young offenders that were part of this kidnapping, I don't know, sales, because it's not even a van. They're just 4 or 5 doing the work. And they were telling us that, in this case, they were with Nueva Generación, and they killed everyone they kidnapped. So probably those are completely out of the spectrum of what you can see, which I assume is something to be considered in yeah, but this was just an afterthought after the comment. But I'm more interested in this resistance of kidnapping could be thought in the same way.
Okay, Emiliano had. If you could, we have like 10 minutes, so I think we'll give the presenters an opportunity to respond, and maybe any other questions we can have in the break, or in one of the other session discussions. But yeah.
So I will just start by saying that there are very serious limitations to the data, and I didn't go into it in the beginning, but this was really an attempt for us to try and understand as broadly as possible where we see migrant kidnapping, what they look like, and I think that a lot of the critiques that everyone's kind of brought are things that we also thought about in the report. By no means did we include any forced disappearances that would have led to the death of the individuals. That is not captured in our data in any capacity. So for example, San Fernando, that was obviously reported on heavily, we didn't include that in the database because it went kind of outside the scope of what we would see otherwise, and so we couldn't make those broader conclusions. So I'll say that, and I would say the same thing in terms of why Nuevo León might be missing. And in fact, Veracruz was missing significantly in both the news reporting and in the data itself. And we, in the report that we wrote, described that as being, also thinking about attacks on journalists and these kinds of issues that may come up in terms of why a kidnapping case would or wouldn't be reported on. So I'll start with that, and I could go even into more detail about kind of the limitations there. And I think, let's see, let's go down these. Thinking about scaling down, the only way that we really analyzed the scaling down question was looking at the size, the average size of migrant kidnapping raids over the course of the 2006 to 2018. And what we saw in all of the scenarios in each of the 4 regions is that they did go down in median size over the course of time. So I can't speak specifically to that kind of infighting because that wouldn't have been reported in the news. But I would say that our data would represent that there are many fewer cases of 100, 200 individuals being held in a stash house, and much more on the 50 and below, even in the Northeast region. But beyond that, again, this is data that came from reporters that is not going to give kind of this granular detail, and we didn't attempt to, and by no means did we supplement this with field work. And so that's another kind of significant limitation. Thinking about the Northwest region and organized crime, I would say that this is probably very, very accurate in terms of thinking about the fact that there are organized criminal groups who are participating in the kidnapping of migrants themselves. We just couldn't detect that in the reporting. And I think we wrote in the report itself about thinking about Paso and the right of kind of being able to operate in this zone. That's certainly something that I've seen in other interviews that I conducted, but it didn't make it into the news reporting, and therefore we just mentioned it without being able to quantify what that would look like in practice. And let's see. I guess, okay, so then thinking back to your question about social services provided and these types of things, I didn't see that in the news report and in our understanding of migrant kidnapping specifically. What we did see, kind of conversely, is in scenarios where individuals, and specifically usually this was women, and we found this through the testimonies more so than the actual news reporting, is that individuals who were unable to pay the ransoms would then somehow be converted into either working within the group, the kidnapping ring, or actually recruiting migrants themselves. And so I don't know that there were scenarios where there were services provided, because this is a very transient population that don't have ties to the communities where they're being kidnapped out of. But there were scenarios where the victims then in some capacity converted into being oftentimes forced, but still perpetrators of crimes themselves. So I think that's what I would speak to on that. In terms of public support, I'm not sure that I'm able to fully answer that with our methodology. But I guess you could kind of look at how small some of these kidnapping rings were and in relation to what communities that they were, specifically in smaller municipalities, looking at how that may be something that's continuing to operate under the guise of no one really paying attention. But I couldn't speak to that in any sort of direct sense. Go. You want to jump in?
Going, just looking really quick at the kidnapping part. I actually wanted to start in smuggling, precisely because of the fact that how much we conflate everything with everything. Organized crime, the logic and the narrative of organized crime has become this great bag. That everything and anything can be organized crime. Anything and everything can be kidnapping. Anything and everything can be trafficking, smuggling. And I wanted to bring the conversation back to smuggling because I think that is not only the practice, but the very persona has been at the core of much of the narrative that is tied to migration. So it is that's why I start there. I was, for example, thinking of how you cited the example of Phoenix, when there were several investigations of the police department, of how the police department itself had conflated parental abductions, with kidnappings and home invasions, and that exponentially, that allowed for the growth of the kidnapping reports. They went from 19 to 200 or something like that within a year. And everything was attributed once again to the smuggler. When, as the work of Dan has also shown, we were looking at this smaller cells of bajadores, or the unloaders, that had a completely different profile from the regular quote-unquote smuggler, and that were actually kidnapping some of the groups of migrants from their smuggling facilitators and taking them to different locations. So more than the hope for bringing in or of centering the discussion on the image of the persona of the smuggler is precisely to question how easy and how easily it has been mobilized and morphed into this persona that can do it all. When, as we have seen, and with thanks to the work of researchers that have actually gone and done some more empirical work, that we are not talking about the same people, that we are not talking about same level of organization, that we're actually seeing different structures, different modus operandi, different forms of collecting money, different forms of spending money, and that they have to be unpacked. So that's more than going into the issue of resistance. I think it's more about that call at this point towards having a better sense of what we are actually talking about in trying to map the way Caitlin and Stephanie have done, you know, the more specific practices. This was a great exercise on how it was actually the first study in trying to make sense despite the limitations and the in terms of the methodology. The work that that your team has also carried out. You know, the very first survey that was documenting fees. And that was what, 2008 when you guys did it? So these have been efforts that, again, point at the way researchers on the U.S.-Mexico border are trying to make sense, looking, you know, even not even getting into the more philosophical discussion into resistance and power, but you know, what are we actually talking about? What are we saying from the border about the border? I think that is also that would also talk about resistance in a way.